Hello, everyone. It's Tuesday, December 2nd. It's just over 11:30 a.m. here in Montreal. Welcome to this interview for the Piar Podcast, coined Internal Communications or Internal Combustion. I'm your host, Tan Sukhera. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Piar, a company that offers specialized training and learning experiences on decision-making, judgment, and out-of-the-box thinking. We work with public relations and communications teams to inject the right frameworks borrowed from adjacent industries at the right time so they can be more strategic, build trust and respect with high-priority stakeholders. Today, I'm joined by a communications thought leader who's built a reputation for leading from the front. He's extremely well-connected and has always taken pride in shining a spotlight on fellow communications professionals to give them a platform and voice. His passion for the industry is only matched by his pursuit of learning, understanding, and gaining priceless perspectives on the inner workings of the global communications industry. I'm speaking about Mike Klein. For more than 25 years, Mike Klein has been a cutting-edge thinker, researcher, and consultant in the internal communications space, as well as being one of the leading community builders in the field. He's the founder of the global #WeLeadComms recognition program. He's editor-in-chief of Strategic Magazine and an IABC Fellow. He holds an MBA from London Business School and has worked with large private and public enterprises in 7 countries on their culture and communication challenges. I've been on the other side of the table a few times with Mike, but by sheer dedication, and it's personally inspirational to me to see him move from strength to strength like this, today, it's his turn to be in the hot seat to help you, the audience, unpack realities of today's global communications industry as we zoom out and look ahead to what lies in store for us in 2026. Thanks for joining me, Mike.
My pleasure.
So you're frequently writing articles, interviewing communications leaders, attending events, and serving industry associations in communications. What's different about 2026 that in all your years actively working in the industry, you've never seen before? And is the hype about transformation just sensationalism, or is there something bigger that's going on right now?
Oh, I think there's something bigger going on, and it's going on very quickly. I call it the big shift. I mean, there's a lot of stuff going on geopolitically, geoeconomically, all of that stuff. But where things are converging in the business space, there's 3 trends that are really at the point of for that, given the term that you use, combustion, if you will. You have AI not only automating work. There's a lot of talk about AI automating work. What there's a lot less talk about is AI's automation accelerating work. But I'm experiencing it day to day in my work life. I mean, I'm on a 6-week study tour looking at internal communication inside of organizations across India at the moment. Coming to you from Delhi, and one of the things that I do is I conduct interviews, I conduct group sessions, I download the transcripts into Claude, and within 2 minutes, Claude gives me a recap of the conversation and compares it to everything that's in my research base. That would have taken me hours. The whole process of putting something together from this research would have taken months. We're going to be able to do something in days because of what AI can do. And the problem with that for employees is that when AI accelerates your work, it's also going to accelerate the speed at which decisions are going to need to be made. Business cultures, particularly here in India, are not set up for that. You have cultures that are set up for escalation, not for decision. And, when people were waiting for a report for 3 months and then wanted to have 2 weeks to review it, there was time for those kinds of decisions. When that report is coming in within 2 days, you're not going to have 2 weeks to review it. You're going to have, maybe a day, maybe an hour, in some cases, in some transactions, in some interactions, maybe a minute. But then there's another, complicating factor is as this is happening, you're having major turmoil in the workforce. You're having layoffs of white-collar staff at highly profitable companies. You're having, the influx of Gen Z into the workplace. Now, in India, there will be some active integration of Gen Z talent, particularly at the top of the talent pyramid. In the US and Europe, what you're hearing now is, we're going to have a hiring freeze for a couple of years until this all fleshes out. Now, the reality is if you leave Gen X talent out, Gen Z talent out in the cold as this is happening. If you're a legacy company, well, that talent's going to go somewhere else. And also, you may end up having to bring that talent in 5 years from now when the good talent's already gone. So, I mean, you're going to have some major talent disruption happening. And among the remaining employees, if you're going through massive amounts of white collar layoffs, the whole social contract, the whole idea that in return for loyalty and what we call employee engagement, you get security. Well, we want your loyalty, but we're no longer going to give you security. That's not a model that's going to work. The whole social contract that we're dealing with certainly in the white collar workforce is also going to go up for grabs as these two acceleration trends are taking place. So this is not a 3-year conversation. This is a 6-month conversation. In certain sectors, it's already happening, certainly in certain sectors here. Now, the question is whether the decision-making architecture of an organization can be realigned so that the remaining people in the organization have sufficient autonomy and discretion to make quick decisions consistently, or whether the whole system is going to break down because of escalation.
Wow. That's a revelation, honestly, Mike. We don't really see many people talking about this from the same perspective that you are right now. A lot of communicators I'm finding are actually drinking the Kool-Aid, if that makes sense. They're insulated from a lot of exposure of what happens when you're making decisions under pressure, under uncertainty, what the risks look like. So to talk about speed to decision and decision making architecture inside of the organization, that just shows me that you're talking to people who are at that high level of strategic
Well,
value.
not a lot of people are talking about this, but when I talk about it with them, they nod and say, yeah, it makes sense. Yeah, they're seeing certain elements of this happening. They're certainly seeing the acceleration of work. They're seeing ChatGPT do in 2 minutes would have taken an intern 2 weeks to do. And people talk about AI being a smart intern. It's also a fast intern. And the acceleration piece of this is not being talked about enough, because I think that's even more significant, particularly in terms of disruption in the workplace and disruption from a communication perspective. Because, when you're in like if you're in a branded company, the brand is putting certain messages, it's putting certain promises out into the space. We behave in a certain way, we do this, we will do this for you, and here's the way in which we do it. And when you're confronted with faster and faster decisions, you need to be able to understand those promises and those guardrails instinctively in a way that employees don't have to now. And that's where internal communication comes in, because there's no one else left to do this. It can't just simply be baked into the software. It can't just be, simply barked down from above. It's got to be, there's got to be much more active understanding, A, and B, there's got to be a culture that, if you behave in a manner that's consistent, even if the decision goes wrong, you have to be able to defend yourself. Otherwise, everyone's going to escalate everything.
That's really powerful. Quick fact, the Gallagher 2025 Employee Communications State of the Sector work shows that 2/3 of leadership teams are treating internal communications as a strategic alignment tool rather than a pure channel function. That's, I think, an interesting point that sort of aligns with what you're saying right now.
Well, I think the findings are probably a bit optimistic, based on my conversations with people on the ground. The main thing is the State of the Sector survey is a self-selected survey. And people who do State of the Sector are people who tend to be plugged into and care about the internal communication space. And there's a lot of willingness around what being a strategic alignment partner actually is. So I think that's good news, but it's not necessarily definitive. And certainly what I'm seeing here, and certainly what you're hearing in the chatter in communication spaces, is the same conversations. We don't have a seat at the table. We're not given access to decision making. We're treated as an execution function, or we don't have a direct relationship with profitability in the bottom line, or we want to focus on things like well-being and belonging and, improving employee sentiment as measured in employee engagement scores. So I think this alignment, it statistic, if you will, is a bit optimistic, but I think that's where we need to get, and it's where we need to get to fairly quickly.
On AI, I recently heard it put this way, that basically 40 years ago, when universities taught accounting, they mostly taught arithmetic, so adding and subtracting, and it was the bottleneck. And there was a famous challenge to tear out a page of the phone book and have the students add up all the phone numbers by hand. But then when Excel came out, suddenly people didn't really need to count as much because it was more accurate and faster than everyone else. And some people may have thought that accountants would disappear at that time, but as we can see in 2026, approaching 2026, they're everywhere. And with Microsoft's
I have
report,
3 of them, so I can totally relate. Between the 3 countries I have to file taxes in. So yeah, there's no shortage of accountants in the world.
Despite the computational power and the speed to arithmetic, but with Microsoft's report on the highest overlap of AI on specific industries, communications was named explicitly. How can communications professionals lean into something that's positive as opposed to being sucked into the negative? And what advice do you offer to the audience?
Well, I have short-term advice and 6 to 18-month advice. I think for now, get used to giving AI the stuff to do that makes your life difficult. There's a lot of talk about, you can give AI the scut work and you have more time to do strategic stuff. And that's true to an extent, but you've got to be the one driving it. You've got to be the one who's, and this is what I do with Claude. I mean, I take the transcripts of the meetings that I have, I feed them into Claude. I ask Claude to do a report. Claude gets it maybe 50% right. And then I tell Claude, this is what I want. This is how to do it. This is what you missed out. And that you rather than just simply delegating the work to AI and taking the first thing that comes out of it, it's really more about, it's about the quality of your interaction. And you've got to treat, certainly Claude as your strategic equal. You've got to treat it as a partner, even though it's a machine that's just simply running a bunch of letters and numbers together. So that's the short term is, use it as much as possible and treat it with as much respect as you can. That's the short term. And the long term, after all of this stuff shakes out, in terms of, the automation and the reduction in the white collar workforce and the acceleration of division processes, communication is going to be the core function that ties everything together. If automation is doing 60, 70, 80% of the work, and in each company in the sector is producing products that are about 80% automated by either the same tool or by similar tools, the sole source of differentiation is going to be the communication, the decision fluency of the organization, and the compelling nature of the organization's story. The basic concept of a brand premium is getting people to pay more for something than it costs to produce. And if you've removed a lot of those costs of production, then you've got to be a lot more clever about what's going to justify that premium. No function is better situated to deliver that in communication.
That reminds me of the fallout that's happening with the management consulting world because of how much how great a reputation they built over time and how much they're known to be charging for the work that they do. And with AI coming into the picture, we've seen that there's also some challenges there in terms of, they on one hand they're charging these premium prices, on the other hand they're boasting about their AI use, and so the customer in the middle is saying, well, then why are you so expensive?
Well, I think medium term, if I was a strategic communicator who was thinking along these lines and at the same time building a narrative for themselves in their organizations or in their industry as being something of an expert, or at least somebody who's comfortable with this space, that's a very strong position to be in, because ultimately we may end up competing with the management consultants. The changes that are happening play to our strengths to a much greater extent than they play to theirs. Because a lot of the stuff that they've worked on optimizing processes, on optimizing decision-making processes or executional processes, that stuff is going to be baked into the software. I mean, yeah, there's going to be continuous improvement in the AI software. There'll be money to be made off of that. But ultimately, it's going to be the extent to which organizations get the humans to play along with the brand promise in this accelerated environment. And the management consultancies have zero experience in being able to do that. That's our strength. That's our bailiwick.
So, on competition of priorities, every function in an organization or every department pushes its own agenda, let's call it. Internal comms is actually the arena where those competing priorities get framed and sequenced and reconciled. So people know what to trade off.
In a best case scenario, yes. I mean, one of the biggest problems with internal comms is that it tends to default to two functions, either HR or marketing, that don't necessarily comfortably host this 360-degree perspective. If you're working for HR, even if HR is ostensibly committed to the company achieving its objectives, HR is much more committed to hitting its own KPIs. And so if you're focusing on the company objectives and you're consuming resources that could otherwise support HR's KPIs, you're in an uncomfortable cost center conversation. If you're reporting to marketing, you're going to be trying to push products and messages and not necessarily support organizational integrity, organizational continuity, organizational velocity. So, either you've got to become you're really in need of three different alternatives. One of which is you've got to be a really good negotiator such that you can get your boss to let you do what the business needs to do. Or B, you've got to be really good at satisfying both the needs of your stakeholder and the needs of the business. And ideally have other people in the business, like, the C-suite folks you don't report to, rooting for you in that C-suite room so that, your boss can't mess with you when your budget comes into play and they want to hire, a global mobility specialist or something like that. The third alternative is to figure out, how you can get into a situation where you're not reporting to one of those two functions. That you're either reporting into the CEO or the chief of staff or to a line function that has sufficient budget and sufficient dependency on the rest of the organization. They have a need for you to play that 360 degree.
And how do you think they'll be able to gain that influence to change who they report to?
Well, in the third case, it's more about going into an organization where it's positioned properly. If you have that 360-degree perspective, and you don't have to. I mean, they're good internal comms people who are really good at driving HR messaging and focusing on things like employee engagement. That I don't think is going to buy you much in this new scenario. But in organizations which are, say, more legacy oriented and will have a bit more time to catch up with the rest of the world, that may still be a viable, option. But I think if you're in one of these functions, the key thing is to try to get as much buy-in from people outside of your own reporting line without alienating your own boss.
So one of the things that I was trying to get at was that when people know what they need to trade off, like they're weighing the different trade-offs in any decision, they can ask why. And now the question is, as things are set to drastically transform and change in 2026, and already in 2025, we have so much execution that's being handled by generative AI, where on the importance scale do you see the propensity to ask why and to sort of carefully weigh those trade-offs, applying that work to the world of internal comms? And if it's at the top, can you think of anything that maybe be more important than asking why and weighing trade-offs?
Well, I think being able to ask why is important. Being able to ask why in a way that's engaging, enrolling, and not necessarily reassuring, but it's at least respectful, is going to be key. Because everybody's going to be going through these changes, and they're going to be unsettling for a lot of people. Particularly, this is where the generational dynamic will come in. Some of these changes will be more unsettling for people at the earliest stages and at the latest stages of their career. People in the middle, they've been through some of these changes or changes of these nature before, but at the same time, they're also not fully exposed to um, to the full strategic front. Now, there's other issues about, where they fit from a, um, from a retention, layoff perspective. And I don't want to talk about that specifically because in most organizations, the criteria for layoffs is fairly arbitrary anyways. But in terms of people who, are going to continue to work in the organization on a day-to-day basis, um, being able to yellow light conversations, yellow light decisions, say, are we sure we want to do this? And particularly, are we sure this is compatible with the vision, the values, the mission, the priority, and the promises that are being made? The less clarity you have about those things, not only does it become harder to ask why, but it also becomes harder to get a definitive answer. And it's that ambiguity that's going to it's either going to cause things to slow down as decisions have to be, addressed on a one-by-one basis, or it's going to cause chaos. Everybody's going to make their own decisions based on their own interpretations of fairly ambiguous stuff. Like if you've got a company value that's called integrity and you haven't defined integrity, say as, not stealing IP, not taking bribes, not, you know, throwing your chemical waste in the swimming pool next door to your factory. If you don't have those things, people are going to come up with their own definitions, and they're going to get really, really militant about anything that deviates from their own definition. And then you're going to have organizational chaos.
Quick fact here, those skills are the essence of judgment and decision making. They're set by thinkers, AI futurists, and academics as the absolute most critical and important skills that business leaders need to train for, like a muscle. That brings you to the next question. So change fatigue was mentioned earlier, the resistance to change, the obstacles and barriers to change, and the disruption caused by change. It's something, as you said, we're all coming to grips with in different capacities and in areas of influence within our daily lives. And obviously, we're all humans. The psychological responses are often fear, uncertainty, and doubt, the FUD, right? And that manifests appearing like indecision, triggers heightened emotional responses, or even immune responses. And to touch on that human side of what you are seeing out there, what advice do you have for communications professionals facing those obstacles to change in a human way?
Well, ambiguity is very tough for people to deal with. And when you've got, ambiguous messages in an organization, ambiguity in the economic climate, people not, a lack of transparency, and, the lack of transparency goes both ways. I mean, if you don't know if your company's going to have layoffs, you're not going to tell your boss that you're looking for another job at the same time. And, the reality is everybody's looking at, all of their options at this point, the companies as well as the employees. One element is at least to recognize that, that you're in this situation, and that, it is what it is. It may not be what you expected. It may, you may feel betrayed for even having to think about this stuff. But the first thing is to at least accept this is the world we're living in. You can recognize that you see it geopolitically, there's big things happening. Economically, there's big things happening. Technologically, there's big things happening. That it shouldn't be that surprising that, the normal, comfortable flow of income and responsibility and, the level of discretion that you have in your job, that's going up in the air to a certain extent until this all settles out. So at least to give yourself the space to recognize that it's not you. I think that's the most important thing. It's not us. None of this is our fault. A. B, we can have a bit more compassion for the people we report to. We expect people to have unbounded compassion for us, for our situations, for our crises, for our meltdowns, etc. We don't necessarily give the people who we report to a lot of compassion. We expect them to have it right. They figure they've got the power, they have this right. Even CEOs. CEOs are increasingly, despised or seen as soulless figures. It's actually pretty brutal to be a CEO. Yeah, the money's good, but it's an extremely isolating job. Everybody's expecting you to be the one to make the decisions. Everybody's afraid of you. Everybody's concerned about you. Everybody doesn't want to get on your bad side. Your very presence causes insecurity to other people in many cases, and that takes a toll on you as well as on the people around you. So, I hate to say this, but I mean, we actually need to have a bit more compassion for the people we're working for. Not that that's necessarily going to buy us anything from them, but I think in thinking that way, then we can give ourselves some more space to be compassionate towards ourselves, not from a victim perpetrator perspective, but from we're all part of this system that's, inefficient and not terribly sensitive to our needs.
Like, I want to talk just for a second about career pathing and training. A lot of the time, the playbook for training is sort of ancient. And then if you look out to the future, the needs are changing, the realities of the organization are changing, transformations on the horizon. So the path to growth, learning for the sake of growth, seems to hit a bit of a roadblock there, because even if companies invest in it, it may be investing in things that maybe worked in the past but won't work for the future. What do you say to that? Are you seeing training as an emphasis right now? And can you help me square the circle here? Because personally, I believe that training for certain skills that, like you said, are uniquely human activities are the things that will benefit us the most, especially because, well, the level of execution is being relegated to the artificial intelligence, generative AI, but also on the flip side, the competitive factor that people have, right? Like the thing that makes you stand apart is going to end up being ultimately decision quality, judgment, these sort of things, how you apply them to the world around you and how you influence others using those skills like a muscle.
Exactly. The combination of, decision speed, clarity, confidence, and compatibility with the people you work with are crucial. Communication, interpersonal communication, as well as strategic communication, as well as, the creative side will remain important because we've got to be the ones who tell AI what to do. AI will, if you're asking AI what to do, they will act on a very limited set of information that's not necessarily organized in the way that matches your reality. So there's still going to be a human element that, you're going to need to be able to have an overview of things. You're going to need to be able to get along with the people that you work with. You're going to need to be able to get them to see how you see things and why there's some benefit to them in aligning their views with yours. So that's one thing. The other thing is you look at the whole, so I mean, the skill and mindset piece, there is some degree of confidence that these things will still remain important. That much being said, my friends in the training industry are saying that this is a brutal time to be in training because people are not buying training. They're buying certain other kind of in-person interventions. They're coming back to conferences. They're interested in things like, mastermind, peer-led support group type things where people can actually hash out their current issues with people who are suitably knowledgeable and interesting. But I can see why there's some hesitancy to train when nobody's really clear about whether they're still going to be in the organizations they're in. So companies are hesitating to pay for training, and also there's some lack of clarity about whether those things that one trains for will actually be even existing skills in a year. And they're, and we're really just kind of hitting the waves of this. My friend Dan Sodergren is an AI futurist. He likes to talk about, we're in the midst of the fifth industrial revolution, that one of the things about revolutions is that we don't necessarily know how they're going to turn out. But he also says we're about halfway through this one, because all of the work that it's taken to get AI, to get this automation, this acceleration to this point, this has actually been, over a decade in the making. And it looks like something that's been happening overnight because it's only, we've only been paying attention to it for a year or two. But at the same time, we can start to see some of the patterns unfold. But at the same time, people are hesitant to invest because they're not sure about it yet. So they're hesitant to invest in training. And employees are also increasingly funny about training as well. I mean, I've offered free training in a number of areas, like probably the most important skill that a communication professional could have on how to make a basic business case. In fact, I was just delivering that training here in Delhi tonight. I'd have 100 people register for my free training, and then 10 show up. And then I see emails or LinkedIn posts complaining about why people don't take them seriously because you don't know how to make a business case. So there's a hesitancy to invest in one's own training, whether it's money or time, that's outside of what's in the company's budget. And I think that's something that should be really a red flag for people. If you're not willing to learn about, what could save your job or what can move you forward because you think it's somebody else's responsibility to give you the money or the time to do that, you're plotting a course for your own obsolescence.
Man, that's a recurring theme. It's something that I'm seeing as well, but from other speakers on this podcast. And I think one thing that really stands out to me is the idea of almost wargaming, like creating scenarios, doing scenario planning, trying to just turn the training into something more interactive, something that people haven't seen before, some sort of fresh perspective. And I think it kind of leads to the point that we were making earlier about, of course you wouldn't invest in it because you're uncertain that the old way of thinking is going to be you'd be right for not investing, frankly, if you're investing in the wrong type of training, right? That's just going to be a waste. And so doing something that's a little bit more maybe out of the box, I think is the advice to training people that I would say, because I personally am also in training, and that's the best way. But it comes to me naturally. It's, to keep things fresh. uh that's just a natural thing for me, but yeah, I do see that if people have limited understanding, it's pretty easy to assume that maybe the stuff that even I do is the old school workshop type stuff.
Well, and I think if people were to look on where to put their money on training, forget about training on AI. You'll train on AI when you use AI. That's how you train. I mean, there's some great trainers if you really want to get some depth into the space, like Dan Sodergren, who I mentioned, for instance. But what I would recommend as at least part of your training discipline is to get to know the adjacent fields that you work with. So if you're an internal comms person, get to know more about PR, get to know more about HR, get to know more about business strategy. If you're, an HR person, get to learn more about business strategy, get to learn more about comms. You know, get to learn more about the stuff that's adjacent, because some of that stuff may be falling into your lap, or you may want to, cross fertilize so that you can make yourself an integrator of data that goes into the system rather than just simply somebody who's plowing one furrow.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
and, certainly learning about other things in the business, like if you're in a company, and, you want to move ahead in the company, maybe this is the time to move from your comms job into a sales job for a year so that you can get a better understanding of how the business actually makes money.
yeah.
Because they're going to need help. They're going to need help with sales and all of this.
There's an upcoming talk with John Emar, and it's going to be on want to win in PR. Think like a business owner. Think like an owner. And I think that's kind of aligned to what you're talking about is taking the initiative to learn more, understand more about how the business works. What kind of forces are maybe your leadership dealing with? What's on their agenda? What's on their minds? What factors are the headwinds and tailwinds and the sort of like the laws of physics, that affect the business. I think that's a really good thing to learn as well, Mike. Maybe we should work on something like that together.
Well, it's interesting that you say that, because that again came up in the workshop in Delhi tonight. We had somebody talking about, thinking like an employee, being the person who thinks like an employee. And I said, well, it's great that you think like an employee, but you also need to think like the CEO at the same time. Because if you're, and this is one of my beefs with internal comms folks, is that they think they're there to advocate for the employees against the big bad, the big bad leadership. And in fact, it's partly the other way around. Ideally, you should be advocating for the company by advocating for the employees. Because, if you can think by like both a CEO and an employee, you can see where the imbalances are and where the opportunities to improve are. And so, yes, you need to think like an owner, but commercially, you got to think like an owner and like a customer at the same time. Otherwise, you're just simply going to be driving the ego side of it and not the responsiveness side of it.
Understand all the stakeholders, figure out the stakeholder matrix, understand the forces that are around him, and start figuring out how you can prioritize these stakeholders. Get into stakeholder mapping. You want to have an introduction to this person here? All right, that you have to go through this chain to get to it.
And also understand the personal motivations on each of those sides too, that it's not just, a community doesn't want, for example, not to have their swimming pool polluted by the factory. But there's a reason they love that swimming pool. This is the most important thing in their lives. I'm giving you that as a silly example, but it's like understanding the emotional and political and civic significance, or, not just the economics, not just the transaction. I mean, one place we're going is that as the transactions become smoother and more seamless, it's going to be less about the transactions. It's going to be a lot more about the experience.
And then also the person who pulled the trigger on the decision of dumping, what sort of biases are they looking at the world through? There's an authority bias. They think the person with the authority that made the decision, let's just blindly follow it. Let's just accept it. Maybe they would have been able to, made a way bigger impact.
This again comes back to alignment and decision criteria, because if you have misaligned KPIs and you're talking about being sustainable on the one hand, but that person's boss says, do the cheapest thing possible. At some point, that whole brand architecture, that whole promise to the customer goes out the window, because the company says it's about customer and sustainability focus, and it's really about costs. And the employees are left to try to figure out and negotiate the difference between it.
Yeah. All right. Wow. What a great conversation, folks. The time is just flying. I hope our audience here enjoyed this and can gain from a different perspective on their future of work, and what a helpful lens this was for communicators to use to view the world around them and their reality through as it relates to communications. Mike, it's been a thrill to have you as my guest. Thank you so much for joining.
My pleasure.